Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. I'm Dr. Abir, and today we will discuss about the histology of integumentary system. So let's begin. First of all, learning objectives. At the end of my presentation, students should be able to identify the principal layers of skin, that is epidermis, dermis and hypodermis, and you should know the functions of each layer. You should be able to differentiate between thick and thin skin, describe the appendages of skin, and finally you should be able to draw and label thick and thin skin on your practical journals. So let's begin. What is integumentary system? So basically, as you know, that skin is the external covering of the body, and then the skin with its appendages, which includes your hairs, nails, your sebaceous glands, sweat glands, erector pili muscles, these all constitute to the integumentary system. Skin and its appendages together constitute the integumentary system. Then we come to skin. That what is skin? It is basically the external covering of the body, and on microscopic level you can appreciate three different layers: epidermis, dermis and hypodermis. You should know each layer individually. Like in epidermis, this whole thickness is called the epidermis, which constitutes about the 5 layers of the skin, which are basal, spinosum, granulosum, corneum and lucidum in thick skin. Then dermis, which again constitutes 2 further sublayers, a papillary layer and a reticular layer. These indentations constitute the papillary layer, and rest of the thickness constitute the reticular layer. Then finally the hypodermis, which constitute mainly of the adipose tissues. So the skin constitutes of 3 layers: the epidermis, dermis and hypodermis. Epidermis with its cell types and layers, dermis, papillary and reticular layer, and the hypodermis, which is the subcutaneous layer and constitute the adipose cells. We will discuss each layer in detail. First of all, we come to the epidermis, which is the uppermost layer. The epidermis constitutes of 4 types of cells and 5 types of layers. The 4 types of cells are called keratinocytes, as the name indicates, and you can see as well we have keratin filaments over here. So this is going to reproduce new keratinocytes. Then melanocytes, melanin granule is here. Langerhans cells will give immune responses, and then the Merkel cells for sensory purposes. So the epidermis constitutes 4 types of cells: keratinocytes, melanocytes, Langerhans cells and the Merkel cell. Now we come to a little bit detail of each type of cell. The first one was keratinocyte. This hole you can see, the keratinocyte, which is the principal cell or the most important cell of the epidermis, and it goes continuous renewal throughout the life, through cell division, through mitosis. So the keratinocytes are produced, they move upward, finally reach the corneum, they are dead, and then they are shed off. This layer, you can see, keratinocytes move upward and finally shed. Then melanocytes. Here you can appreciate melanocyte between stratum basale and spinosum. The melanocytes are very important as they give color to our skin and they protect us against any damage by ultraviolet radiations. Langerhans cells, these are the Langerhans cells. They take part in immune responses, fight against any foreign body. And then finally we have the Merkel cell. You can appreciate the sensory neuron. This will give the tactile sensations, and they are more abundant in those areas where the sensory perception is more acute, like in fingertips and lips. So this was about the types of cell, that there are 4 types of cells: the keratinocytes, which are self-replacing and continuously mitoting throughout the life; then melanocytes, which are giving color to the skin plus protecting from the ultraviolet radiations; then we have the Langerhans cells, which will protect against any kind of immune responses; and then the Merkel cell, which will appreciate the sensory stimulations and perceptions. Then we come to the layer of epidermis. As I have told already, like epidermis constitutes 5 layers of epidermis and 4 cell types. So the layers of the epidermis are stratum basale, stratum spinosum, stratum granulosum, stratum lucidum, and stratum corneum. So one by one, when we look at stratum basale, this whole layer is stratum basale. It is a single layer of low cuboidal or low columnar cells that rest on the basement membrane. This is the basement membrane, and cuboidal or columnar cells are resting on it with a large oval nucleus, and then on their lateral borders we have desmosomes, and towards the basal lamina we have hemidesmosomes. So this constitute the basal layer of the skin, known as stratum basale. It is continuously dividing by mitosis, and as we reach upward, it's continuously replacing in the above layers. Then we have stratum spinosum. The stratum spinosum layer consists of polyhedral cells. These are the polyhedral cells with almost spherical nucleus. Stratum basale with oval nucleus, stratum spinosum with spherical nucleus. And as we reach upwards, the stratum spinosum becomes flattened. The stratum basale plus the stratum spinosum are collectively known as the Malpighian layer, because the production of new keratinocytes occur only in the Malpighian layer. So these both layers constitute the Malpighian layer, which is termed as layer of germinatum, stratum germinatum, as they both produce new keratinocytes. Then as we go upward, we have stratum granulosum. This is almost 3 to 5 layers thick, and the cytoplasm of these cells constitute basophilic granules known as keratohyalin granules. As we move upward, the cell organelles are lost, and before moving into the next layer, the cells become dead, means without any mitotic figures. So in the basal, you can appreciate mitotic figures, spinosum, in few layers of the granulosum, and as we reach upwards, the mitotic figures are lost and the cells are dead. Then we have stratum lucidum, which is a specific feature of thick skin only and consists of 3 to 5 layers. The nuclei and the organelles are absent. The nuclei and the organelles are absent, and the cytoplasm consists primarily of the keratin filaments or a refractile substance called elidin. You can see mitotic figures are absent, and there's a refractive layer made up of a substance called elidin. Then finally we have the stratum corneum, which has many flattened cell layers that are keratinized, and they are divide of the nucleus. The cells become more and more keratinized as the surface is approached. The cell membrane becomes thick and is coated by extracellular layer of phospholipids and glycosphingolipids, which constitute the major component of the water barrier in epidermis. The stratum corneum becomes even thicker in those regions where they are subjected to excessive friction. So these are basically the 5 layers of epidermis. Stratum basal, resting on the basement membrane, which is low columnar or cuboidal with an oval nucleus. Stratum spinosum, which is polyhedral shaped cells with spherical nucleus. Stratum granulosum, rhomboid shape almost, with keratohyalin granules. Then we have stratum lucidum, which is a refractile layer, and then we have corneum, which are the dead cells, and it will eventually replace. Now you can see this picture is appreciated under the microscope. Here you can see this is the basement membrane, and here is the stratum basal. The first layer is stratum basal. The second layer is stratum spinosum. You can see the polyhedral cells. You can appreciate the spherical nucleus. Here you can appreciate the oval nucleus. Then with the granulosum, which is rhomboid shape, and with the purple dark spots, which are the keratohyalin granules. The stratum lucidum, which is refractile layer devoid of cell organelles or mitotic figures. Then finally the biggest corneum, which is composed of dead cells, which are stratified desiccumated cells. Then under microscope, this whole thickness, constitute the epidermis. So the first layer starts from here, stratum basal, spinosum, granulosum, and here is the stratum corneum. So this was all about epidermis. Now we start with the dermis or corium, which is a sheet of connective tissue that supports the epidermis and binds it to the subcutaneous tissue. So this whole major chunk is the dermis, and of course its thickness varies almost in every different part of the body. It ranges from 0.5 millimeter to almost 3 millimeters in palms and soles. And it also lodges the hair follicles and the sweat glands and the nerve endings. Consisting of two layers, we have the papillary layer and the rest of the reticular layer. The papillary layer is so called because of the projections that protrude from the overlying dermis. These are the papillary projections, and it is thinner than the reticular layer. It is made up of loose connective tissue. This layer, it is thin and made up of loose connective tissue, plus it is highly vascular and contains numerous capillary loops that regulate the body temperature. They have the sensory receptors also, especially on fingertips and lips. So yes, this is the papillary layer, which constitute the loose connective tissue, which is highly vascular with nerve endings also. And then we have the reticular layer, which is thicker and made up of dense, irregular connective tissue. When I talk about dense, irregular connective tissue, this automatically should come into your mind that it should contain all the qualities of the dense connective tissue. Like, it will be having fibroblasts, mast cells, T lymphocytes, fat cells, the Pacinian corpuscles, and the Ruffy's corpuscles. The reticular layer, which is made up of loose connective tissue, and the reticular layer, which is made up of dense irregular connective tissue. The papillary layer are due to the indentations. Now under the microscope, you can appreciate this thickness is the epidermis, and other than this, this is the dermis. The dermis papillary layer, which is thin, and this whole is the reticular layer, which is thick. After the dermis, you should also appreciate between thick and thin skin, which is very important. The thick skin is the skin which covers our palms, soles, and surface linings of the fingers and toes. The rest of the body is covered by the thin skin. As the name indicates, thick skin has thick epidermis and thin skin has thin epidermis. No hair follicles, it contains hair follicles. Thick skin, no erectile pili muscles, thin skin contains them. The dermis is thin, the dermis is thick. Then it lacks sebaceous glands, then thin skin contains sebaceous glands. The thick skin has numerous sweat glands, whereas thin skin has fewer sweat glands. Denser sensory receptors, as I've already mentioned before, that it's on the fingertips, they're in high numbers, and sparser in sensory receptors. Then it contains few ridges and furrows on the surface. It lacks the ridges and furrows. This was in a tabulated form. Now you can appreciate under microscope. This is the thin skin and this is the thick skin. Stratum basale in both of the layers, stratum spinosum in both of the skins, stratum granulosum in both of the skin. Then thick skin has a special quality of having stratum lucidum, which is only present in thick skin, and you can see there is no lucidum in thin skin. So this is one of the major differences between a thick and a thin skin. Then finally stratum corneum, which is present on both thick and thin skin. So the stratum lucidum is a very important feature. Here you can also see the thick skin, which is hairless, and thin skin, which is hairy. So in thin skin, thick skin, you can see epidermis, the dermis, which has the papillary layer with lots of vascular supply, and then reticular, which is made up of loose, irregular connective tissue. Hypodermis, which is a fatty layer. Here in thin skin, in epidermis, you can see the shafts. In dermis, you can appreciate the hair follicle, the sebaceous gland, the rectus pili muscles. Hypodermis is almost same in both except of the thickness. Fatty in thick skin and thin in thin skin. Sweat glands present in both. So thick skin basically covers our palms and soles, and thin skin covers the rest of the body. The color of the skin is determined by 4 pigments that contains melanin, brownish black pigment, carotene, which gives yellowish color, hemoglobin, that gives purple color, and oxyhemoglobin, red color. So this all constitutes and determines the final color of the skin. Now we will move on to the appendages of the skin, which constitutes the hairs, nails, glands, and rectus pili muscles. So when we come to the hair, these are the keratinized threads derived from the epidermal epithelium, and it contains of a shaft which comes out from the epidermis and a root. The hair shaft consists of the epithelial cells arranged in 3 layers. That is the medulla, which forms the central axis. As you can see here, it is in the center, and forming the central axis with 2 or more layers of the cuboidal cells. Then cortex, beside them medulla was in the center. In periphery we have the cortex. The cortex of the hair composed of long fusiform keratinized cells, and they have melanin in them also. Medulla, cortex, and then we have the cuticle. It is a single layer of the keratinized cells. So the hair shaft consists of medulla, the cortex, and the cuticle of the hair. And then we move towards hair follicle or the hair bulb, which comprises of the inner root sheet and outer or external root sheet. The inner root sheet consists of further 3 layers, that are the cuticle, Huxley, and Henle. The cuticle is the inner layer, also contains clear horny cells that overlap each other. Then we have the layer Huxley with polyhedral cells, and Henle with lots of low columnar cells. The outer root sheet, this is the inner root sheet and this is the outer root sheet. The outer root sheet corresponds to the Malpighian layer of the epidermis, and it has several layers of polygonal cells. surrounded by low columnar cells. Hair bulb, hair papilla. So this is basically the shaft, which consists of the medulla and the cortex. Then we have the inner root sheet and the outer root sheet. This is the hair bulb. Now we move on towards nails, where you can appreciate that it is a translucent triangular rectangular plate that covers the dorsal surface of the terminal phalanges. This is a translucent rectangular plate that is covering the dorsal surface of the terminal phalanges. It has a body, which is the visible part, the free edge, which projects from the skin, and root, which is the proximal part. Body, free edge, and towards here we have root. As you can appreciate here, it's going downward. The proximal part of the nail body is also known as lunula. Then there is a nail groove as well between nail fold and nail bed. Between the nail fold and nail bed, we have a nail groove. Then in the appendages we have glands also. The basic histological structures was taught to you in the lecture of glands, the types of glands. But here I just want to recall the sebaceous gland, which is enclosed in a thin connective tissue capsule, also known as the oil gland. And when we look at under the microscope, you can see the cluster of cells which are full of sebaceous materials. This kind of picture was also appreciated under microscope. If you just recall back, and then sweat glands also. Sweat glands, these types of slides were shown to you in your practicals. So the appendages constitute of the hair, the nail, the glands, and the erector pili muscle, which is smooth muscle arising from the root of the hair. And this actually gives you goosebumps. So this was all about the appendages. Now I would like to give you a brief summary of what we have studied. The skin comprises of 3 layers: the epidermis, dermis, and the hypodermis. The epidermis constitutes the 4 cell types, which were the keratinocytes, the Langerhans cells, the melanocytes, and the Merkel cells. Then we have 5 types of layers: 5 in thick skin and 4 in thin skin: stratum basale, which is a low cuboidal or columnar layer; stratum spinosum, which is a polyhedral shape; stratum granulosum, rhomboid shape with keratohyaline granules; and stratum corneum, which constitutes the flattened cells. Then the dermis constitutes two further layers, the papillary layer, which consists of capillary bed and made up of loose connective tissue, and then the reticular layer, which is made up of dense irregular connective tissue, which contains the vascular plexus, the lymph nerves, appendages, collagen fibers, thick elastic fibers. Then finally we have the adipose tissue, which constitute the hypodermis. This is your assignment. You have to attempt all 3 MCQs. Then there is a SCQ, name the cells of the epidermis, describe about dermis, describe the water barrier layer, and then you have to write any 4 differences between thick and thin skin. And finally you will have to make a labeled diagram of thick and thin skin on your practical journals and write 2 identification points. If you don't have your journals at the moment, doesn't matter, you can make it on any A4 size paper and then you can stick it on later. For more references, first of all you have to follow your textbook, that is Laikosan, and other than that there is a wide variety of resources on Google and YouTube. For any questions, you can WhatsApp me in our group. Thank you. I hope you find this presentation beneficial.